Sonic gasped. The air was thin, yet wonderful, and all that time he had spent in those horrible caves and corridors only made the cold air feel better against his fur, for even though it was cold, the wind's movement meant it was alive, unlike the sky, which still hovered above, utterly dead and motionless. After using chaos control, both he and Metal found themselves atop a sheer mountain cliff, which meant he was now all the closer to the terrible, starless void, and further still from his life and friends back on Earth. Sonic shook his head and looked back at the mountain fields scattered before him. Scant sagebrush disappeared into the perpetual nightfall. Their twisted, harsh forms and purple needles struggled to live in the high altitude. "Interesting. I did not imagine a mountain in this world," Metal said. He slipped out of Sonic's hands and stood up. "Why's that?" Sonic asked. "Mountains are the result of plate tectonic activity. They can only exist in a world with active geology, which means the core of the planet is hot. Wherever we are, this planet is alive." Sonic shook his head. "See, that's been bothering me. There are no stars, so there must be no sun either. But why are there plants? Don't they need the sunlight?" "It's not only plants that need sunlight. Without the warmth of a star, this planet should be completely frozen." Metal knelt down and snapped a twig of a sagebrush. It snapped away easily, as if the plant were deadwood. "This plant is dying," he said. Sonic looked up at the sky. It was as horrible and empty as ever, although he thought, for just a moment, he saw a tiny cloud struggling into existence across the horizon. "Given all the data, I think this planet must have lost its sun recently. It could not have happened more than a few days ago. In fact, given how long we have been here, it must have happened just as we were captured, which means we need to escape soon. It's getting colder every day, and if we are here for too long, we will freeze with the planet." The wind stirred again, and this time Sonic shivered. Metal wasn't kidding. He continued. "Nega must be unbelievably powerful. The sky is empty because we are so far away, not even the speed of light is fast enough to reach us. So if Nega moved an entire planet out here, it means he found a way to move faster than the speed of light." Metal clenched his fists and gazed at the crate on his side. "It is as I suspected. Nega has found a way to control the very laws of physics, and he is using the Chaos Emeralds to do so." "That reminds me." Sonic opened his palm and revealed the Chaos Emerald, which shone dimly green in the darkness. "Meds, I hate to tell you this, but this emerald, it's fake." Metal scooped the emerald into his hand, and Sonic continued. "I knew it as soon as I used Chaos Control. It still has some power, but no more than a Chaos Drive. Nega must still have the real one." "This does not surprise me," Metal said as he slid the emerald into his crate. "I suppose that portal was fake too. It could have led anywhere, although, knowing Nega simply wished to be rid of me, I do not think it led anywhere pleasant." "Did you know the portal was fake when Nega offered it to you?" Sonic said. Metal shook his head. "I had not considered the thought, although now I know to update my models with Nega's untrustworthiness. Still, even if the portal were real, I still would have stayed with you." Metal looked down at his hand. "I remember what you told me, about how I must choose who I am. I still cannot answer that question. Truth be told, I am not sure if I ever will. Perhaps no one really knows who they are. But I did know, in that moment, that I did not want to be someone who would abandon his friends. Am I loyal? I cannot answer. Perhaps I'm delusional, but maybe it does not matter who I think I am. Maybe all that matters is how I act." Metal began to trudge further up the mountain, illuminating the path with his red headlight, and Sonic followed. Dozens of rocks and boulders protruded from the ground, so they had to tread slowly. "I've never really thought about it before, but maybe you're right," Sonic said, watching the pebbles crumble underneath the weight of his robotic leg. "Maybe there isn't just one big single thing to be." Sonic looked back at the sky. The little cloud was definitely there, and it was growing darker every minute. Sonic wished it luck, for a cloudy sky was better than no sky at all. They trudged onward, and the cold air nipped at Sonic's skin. He wanted to run, but given the difficult terrain, he could only move at Metal's painfully slow pace and stare at the sky. The pile of clouds was growing. "Do you see that?" Metal's voice brought him back to the ground. He followed Metal's outstretched arm to the horizon, where he could barely make out a tiny wooden shack. "What is it?" Sonic said. "I am unsure, but I do know it could give us valuable insight into this planet. We should investigate further." Sonic leapt forward, preparing to sprint, but Metal held out his hand. "We do not know if there is friend or foe, so we should proceed with caution." He sighed, but Metal was right, so he followed behind him as Metal crept towards the building. Now that he was closer, Sonic noticed local materials made up the building. The walls were made from yellow tree trunks, and purple grass, piled into several great bundles, thatched the roof. The mismatched colors made the shack look more like a children's coloring book drawing than a proper shelter. They must be facing the rear of the shack, because Sonic couldn't see any windows. His suspicion was confirmed as they walked to the front, where the only opening was a splintering door. Metal walked up to it. He tried to open the door quietly, but the structure was so poorly maintained that he had to heave it aside. "So much for stealth," Sonic shrugged. Metal illuminated the inside of the building with his light. It was even smaller inside, and barren too, for within there were only a couple of stools and cooking supplies. At first, the floor looked impossibly dusty, but as Sonic knelt down and brushed his finger on the floor, he realized it was made of dirt. "I do not think Nega built this shack. He would never build something so rustic and low-tech," Metal said. A small box, coated in dust, sat on the tidy table next to the stools, and Sonic walked over to it. Inside, a half-melted candle laid in a scattering of matches. He brushed the dust from the candle, struck a match, lit it, and then walked back to Metal. But someone had to have built this shack. Someone who's not Nega. Someone who's still out there, Sonic said. Metal clicked off his light as the dim, yellow flame flickered against his armor. "Someone, or some people. It would require a whole society to develop technology such as this candle and those matches. This planet must be inhabited by intelligent life." Sonic watched each drop of wax drip down the candle and into the dirt. Metal continued. "Without the sun, this planet will die, and everyone here will die with it." "Well then, that makes things easy," Sonic said. "What do you mean?" Sonic looked up at Metal. "It's simple. We're gonna save the planet." "Save the planet? Sonic, we can barely take care of ourselves. My engine is destroyed, and your health, while improved, is still precarious. We need to focus on our escape above all else." Sonic shook his head. "I spent all this time feeling sorry for myself, and now I found out there are people out there, a whole world of people, who are going to die unless we find the sun. So we're gonna find the sun, and we're gonna kick Nega's tail while we're at it." "But how? How can we possibly do that?" Sonic paused. He had to convince Metal, and he had an idea. "Okay, Mets, how are we going to escape?" Metal folded his arms and looked away. "I am still processing the data." "Well, consider this. You don't know how to escape, but I know how to save the planet. It's easy. All we need to do is find the sun. So saving the planet is easier than escaping because we know how to do it. And once the planet is saved, I'm sure everyone here would help us return home. Therefore, the optimal way for us to escape is to save the planet." Metal glared at him, then slapped his forehead and groaned. "I am not sure if your reasoning is sound, but so be it. I know I am not going to convince you otherwise, and I certainly cannot let you do this alone. We only have one lead anyway." Metal turned and walked back to the door. Sitting down on the threshold, he tossed open the crate and rummaged through the contents. Sonic followed him, taking his own seat next to Metal and still holding the candle in his hand. He looked back across the landscape. The clouds had grown much thicker now, and they loomed ominously above. Metal pulled the fake emerald from the crate, as well as Nega's research notes. He held the emerald up and shook his head. "I never did understand how you work these. You have always done so many amazing things with the Chaos Emeralds, from becoming supersonic to using chaos control, and neither myself nor Eggman ever understood how you did it." Sonic dug the candle into the dirt, then leaned over and took the fake emerald from Metal's hand. "I couldn't tell you how. I just sort of make them work, I guess. You know, Knuckles would always say that Chaos Emeralds turn thoughts into power. That's why there's the Master Emerald. The Chaos Emeralds turn thoughts into power, and the Master Emerald can stop them." Metal flipped through the notes. He trailed his finger over the page and shook his head. "But that makes no sense. How could thoughts be anything other than thoughts? As complex as Nega's system is, at least it makes sense." He turned to face Sonic. "Can you elaborate on the Master Emerald? How does that work?" "Dunno. Like I said, it just works. I mean, it makes sense if you think about it. The Chaos Emeralds are really powerful, so there has to be something that can neutralize all that power. Metal's stare intensified, so much so that Sonic felt he was staring through him. The Master Emerald neutralizes the Chaos Emeralds? How? How does it do that? Tell me, Sonic, I must know! Like I said, I don't know. It just does. There isn't always an answer for everything, Meds. Sometimes things just are. Metal tore his gaze away and stared at the dirt. He didn't say anything else, nor did he look at the notes. He just stared at nothing. Sonic bit his lip. Has he said something wrong? He slid closer to Metal. Close enough his accursed legs stuck to Metal again. He needed to get better control of his magnet, because it kept activating without his thought. Here, let me show you. Taking Metal's hand into his own, he placed the emerald in his palm and curled Metal's fingers over the top, then wrapped his own hand around Metal's. Focusing the emerald in his mind, he pulled energy from the gem, not enough to do anything substantial, but just enough to make the emerald glow brilliant green as the energy flowed around them both. You've got to feel the emerald in your heart, focus on a single thought, and push all others from your mind. Then, you pull the energy from the emerald. Sonic pulled his hand away, and the emerald's glow slowly died. Metal held the emerald up, and he must have been trying to activate it, because Sonic could see his optics straining concentration, but nothing happened. He sighed. If you have to feel it in your heart, then it is pointless. I will never get it to work, because I have no heart. That's not true. Sonic placed his hand over Metal's chest. The cold air made him welcome that familiar warmth all the more. I can feel your heart. It's right here. Metal wrapped his hands around Sonic's and held it to his chest. He gazed in Sonic's eyes, but said nothing. Still, he did not look away, and neither did Sonic. As Metal began to speak, an enormous flash cracked through the clouds and illuminated the ground just enough for the shadows of Sagebrush to flicker into existence. The clouds erupted into an explosive roar as water began to pour in waving sheets. With a single hiss, the candle flame died. Water splashed against his fur, and Sonic immediately leapt backwards to the cabin lest he get completely soaked. Hastily, he scooped up the candle just as Metal shoved his notes and the emerald back into the crate. While Metal heaved the door back into place, Sonic trudged to the table. He struck another match and hovered it above the wick. The match burned, but the wick refused to take, and the candle merely sat inert in his hand. There is no point. The candle will not realize until it's dry. Sonic turned to see Metal looking back at him. Water dripped from the ends of his quills and mixed into mud on the floor. He sighed, then dropped the candle back in the box. I guess we're stuck here then, unless you want me to use chaos control. Metal shook his head. If this emerald is fake, then unlike the real emerald, it has limited energy. I do not know how many uses it has, and it would be wiser to save it. Sonic let out a sharp breath and shivered as the air from his lungs puffed into mist. He had thought it was cold before, but now the pouring rain had sucked what little warmth was left. Desperately, Sonic looked around for a stove, or firewood, or anything, but the only thing he found was a small plank of yellow wood with a moth-eaten blanket crumpled over top. He trudged over to it, plopped down on the wood, and pulled the blanket over his shoulders. It was disgusting and dirty, but his fur was matted with so much dirt that it made no difference. Then he remembered. Wait, we can't stay here. There's no electricity. Just give me the emerald. Metal came and sat beside him. I have enough power reserves for one more day, and the only place we know with electricity is Nega's horrible maze. But with your speed, I'm sure we can find an alternative source of electricity tomorrow. Well, if you're sure, Sonic said. He watched the ribbons of light that occasionally flashed through the roof. Despite the fact the shack was made from nothing but grass and logs, it seemed to be holding out the rain. At least save some battery by turning off your light. Metal's light died with a click, and despite the lightning, it was now utterly dark. Sonic could only see the two ovals of his optics. He yawned. The familiar exhaustion was building behind his eyes, as was the headache. He rubbed his eyelids. The longer he didn't move, the more tired he felt, and the more tired he felt, the more the cold air clung to his skin. You should try to get some sleep. We can plan our next action tomorrow, Metal said. All right. Sonic laid down and closed his eyes, but shivers racked his body, and he was unable to lay still. He tried to clear his mind and forget the cold, but his soaked fur and exposed skin would never let him. He had never felt so cold in his life, because even in the ice zones, he had never stopped running. He groaned and turned over. Maybe if he held perfectly still, the blanket would trap his body heat. He tried it, but now he was moving even less, and the cold sunk in even further. He was caught in the awful limbo between being too exhausted to get up and too cold to sleep. But just as he was about to scream, Metal stirred. "Sonic, I need to apologize to you." Sonic turned over and shivered. "Apologize?" "My whole existence, I have done nothing but try to kill you, and while I now know that is impossible, I did manage to hurt you, sometimes severely, multiple times. But despite all that, you still trusted me back in Nega's prison. Even after I had betrayed you again, you still trusted me. You saved me, Sonic, both from Nega and from myself. I owe you so much. Despite everything, you have done so much." Metal slumped and buried his hands in his face. "I know it means nothing, but all I can say is, I am sorry. I should have never attacked you. It's not even what I was programmed to do." Sonic's teeth chattered, and he held his voice as steady as he could. "That's in the past. You've helped me now, and that's all that matters. And I've been just as cruel to you, treating you like one of Eggman's stupid robots. You're different, Meds. You're..." Sonic cupped his hands around Metal's wrist and froze. Whatever he was going to say next, it didn't matter, because all ideas had fallen out of his head. He only had a single thought. "You're warm. Oh, you're so warm. But of course you're warm. You're always warm." Metal's optics flickered, and he brought his palm to rest over Sonic's hand. He paused for a moment, then immediately pressed his finger to Sonic's neck. "Sonic, you are freezing, and your irregular heartbeat!" Metal's other hand was still in his own, and it felt so nice and warm against his fingers. He brought it up to his face and pressed Metal's palm to his cheek, all of that glorious heat radiating from Metal's hand into his skin. "I have been far too careless. I should have known you were not ready for all that running, and now the air temperature is approximately 2 degrees centigrade. You're at risk of dying of exposure." Sonic leaned forward, closer and closer, until the fur on his chest pressed against the radiating heat of Metal's leg, and his forehead buried in the smooth warmth of Metal's side. "I know it's cold, but you're so warm. Just come here." "I see. Of course. The solution is close to optimal, but I need to make one modification." Metal gently pulled Sonic away and rolled the blanket from his shoulders. "Metal, come back," Sonic said. He was shivering again. He had almost been warm enough to sleep, but now the cold was leaking back into him. "I'm still here." Metal laid by his side and draped the blanket over them both. The heat was back, and Sonic latched onto it by clicking his foot to Metal's leg. He wanted to get as close to the heat as he could, so he curled his arms onto Metal's chest and buried his forehead beneath Metal's chin. Although this was much better, he still felt the fur on his back fighting in vain against the cold air. Slowly, Metal wrapped his arms around Sonic's back, taking care not to touch his injury, and pulled him closer. The warmth from Metal's arms soaked into his back, and the blanket kept the cold away. "Are you comfortable?" Metal said. "Mm-hmm," Sonic managed to say. Even though the smell of dust was everywhere, Metal's scent cut through his attention like the lightning did in the sky. It was stringent, yet smooth, like the smell of ozone drifting up from the pavement after a rainstorm. His attention began to wander, from the wonderful heat blocking out the unending cold, to the scent, and to his exhaustion. In the end, his exhaustion won out, and slowly, his consciousness faded to sleep. He fell soundly asleep, unmoving except his breath, which misted Metal's optical screens as he breathed. Metal brought his hands up to Sonic's neck again, and not even that was enough to wake him. It was his pulse. Metal thought it had stabilized, but it was still beating weakly and irregularly against his fingers. Metal cursed himself. He had been careless to let Sonic get in the state again. Nega's notes were so complex that Metal had dedicated every spare clock cycle to their analysis, but in the process, he had completely neglected his most important priority, to neutralize Sonic the Hedgehog. But Sonic would be warm enough now. His heartbeat would stabilize as long as he got enough rest, and it would be easy for Metal to monitor his condition when they were so close together. He now had a few cycles to spare, and he needed to spend them on the newest item of his query stack. Sonic had said there was an energy in the Chaos Emeralds, an energy the Master Emerald could neutralize. It was Sonic's choice of words that had captured Metal's attention. The Master Emerald neutralized the Chaos Emeralds, and that was it. Neutralize had multiple definitions, including one that was precise and scientific. When two opposite things react in a predictable way, they neutralize each other. The examples were countless, and indeed, Metal had encountered them all before. A base, like sodium hydroxide, was the opposite of an acid, like hydrochloric acid. A base could neutralize an acid. A positive electrical charge would neutralize a negative electrical charge, and this was the very foundation of the electromagnetic force. Antimatter would neutralize matter. A positive and negative number would sum to 0, and two opposite waves would cancel each other out. Metal's CPU spun as he tried to process the logic as fast as he could. A neutralization reaction required two components, two things that were exactly the same except for a single feature: matter and antimatter, positive numbers and negative numbers, and the two poles of the electromagnetic force. All were essentially the same thing, except for their signs. And what triggered these reactions? That was the elegance of it. Neutralization reactions were some of the most fundamental in nature. The two components had to do nothing but touch each other, and the inevitable laws of physics would take care of the rest. He pulled Sonic closer to himself, and Sonic responded by murmuring and pressing his cheek into Metal's shoulder. Just as before, the answer was painfully obvious. Here it was, the solution to his primary objective, and he had been too caught up in his own delusions to ever notice. He wasn't Sonic's copy, he was his complement.